When you imagine the skyline of New York City, you probably envision a line of skyscrapers. But if you look down, you might see a bridge or a highway running along the water. If you're walking down the city street, you might pass a quaint park or two. You'll see a collection of tiny windowed brick buildings rising up from a grassy meadow. You might even venture to see a play at Lincoln Center. Now this sounds like a list of things to describe a city that could have been pulled out of a hat. But in New York City, they were all built by one man. And that man was Robert Moses. Born on December 18th, 1888 in New Haven, Connecticut, Robert Moses' life was immediately shaped by his domineering mother, Bella Moses. The youngest of three, Bella was known in her community as a strong-willed and outspoken woman, traits that her son Robert would soon inherit. Emmanuel Moses, Robert's father, was a successful department store owner. In 1897, Bella pushed him to sell his store, enter into early retirement, and move to New York City when Robert was 9 years old. As they grew up in an upscale New York neighborhood, Robert and his brother Paul attended a series of prestigious preparatory schools, supplemented by private tutors who would come give the boys instruction in their own home. As they grew, it was clear that both were going to inherit Bella's outspoken character. Bella was deeply involved in the settlement house movement at the time. Settlement houses are charity organizations for new immigrants to the United States around the turn of the century. They provided living accommodations as well as language classes and social events. While well-intentioned, Bella's charity often struck a patronizing tone, something that would later be seen in Robert's own work with the needy. Moses' college years, it's important to note the family's views on religion. While born into a German-Jewish family, Bella, against Emmanuel's wishes, made sure to raise her sons in a secular household. Robert Moses did not consider himself Jewish, a view not shared by his peers at Yale. While not anti-Semitic on paper, Yale in 1905 was an almost entirely Protestant institution. Moses was one of 2 Jewish students in his year, something that made him a bit of an outcast when it came to his time in university. A bit of a loner his freshman year, Moses' dedication to his studies slowly earned him the respect and eventual friendship of many of his peers. As a sophomore, he became involved with the Coriant, a literary journal for which he wrote poetry, as well as the swim team. It was here that the first signs of who Robert Moses would become began to show. There was football, and then there was everything else, the minor sports, as they were called. Swimming was one of these, as well as basketball, hockey, and a couple more. Each of these sports struggled with funding to a different degree. Moses proposed unifying their administrations into a student-run minor sports association. After persuading the sports involved to enter in a semesters-long fight with the school administration, this vision became a reality. Now, all donations to one of the minor sports would be a donation to all of the minor sports. This became an issue for Moses when he tried to drum up funding from swim team alumni Og Reed, a longtime donor. It was feared now that Reed's donations might stop if he knew the money was going to be split among all the minor sports. Moses proposed a simple solution. He just wouldn't tell Og Reed. Moses ran this by swim team president Ed Richards, who found blatantly lying to an alumni unacceptable. Moses responded what would one day become a signature threat: "We'll do it my way, or I'll resign." Moses hadn't counted on one thing. As a junior in college, Robert Moses had no power or influence to put behind that threat. Richards accepted his resignation on the spot, and Robert Moses was out. The following year, in 1909, Moses received his bachelor's degree in politics and economy from Yale. He immediately enrolled in graduate school at Oxford University. England was love at first sight for Moses, who immediately acclimated to the culture of upper-class Britain. A lavish lifestyle would become a theme throughout Moses' life. During his Oxford years, he was known for being the man to always pick up the check at dinner. He was also quick to fall in love with the colonial-era elitism found throughout civil service education in England. This was another hallmark of Moses' career first appearing: racism. During a convention of colonial nations on the topic of self-governance, he declared that the subject peoples of the British Empire would not be capable of self-governance for quite some time. The thesis he wrote at the end of his time at Oxford also dripped with the aristocratic elitism that was picked up at the prestigious university. Moses believed in a meritocracy. Of course, to be meritorious in Robert Moses's eyes, you must have attended one of the Ivy League schools, not just college, something that only a handful of Americans did at the time to begin with, but one of the 7 Ivy League universities. And even some of those were a stretch in his eyes. If Robert Moses had his way, the leader of every American government agency would have graduated from Yale, Harvard, or Princeton. Directly out of Columbia, Moses called on family connections and was hired by the Bureau of Municipal Research. The Bureau was a progressive think tank, before there were really think tanks, created by good government reformers of the era. To give some background about turn-of-the-century New York politics, the city's government operated under a machine political system called Tammany Hall. Machine politics relies on a system of patronage, jobs for votes. This kept Tammany leaders in power, but didn't always put the most qualified candidates into public jobs. The good government movement arose in response to this system. The Bureau of Municipal Research's response to patronage was to find ways to implement scientific management techniques into the city bureaucracy. Moses' ideas about civil service were a perfect fit for this goal. The Bureau is also where Moses met his wife, Mary Louise Sims. However, Moses quickly grew tired of the college-like atmosphere within the office. He wanted to do something with a lasting impact. Though his constant attempts to gain authority within the organization annoyed his superiors, they couldn't deny his dedication or his work ethic. In 1914, a good government candidate, John Perroy Mitchell, was elected mayor, and Moses got his wish. He was appointed to work as the secretary of the newly created Civil Service Commission, tasked with drafting a report for the mayor outlining how civil service in New York City could be reformed. Moses spent the following year consumed by this task, and here's what he came up with. Moses took an all-or-nothing approach, meaning that this system wouldn't just affect new candidates applying for positions. He wanted all 50,000 current city employees to have their pay reduced to an entry-level salary until they took a test and were replaced according to the new pay scale that he devised based on ability. His plan also replaced time-based pay raises with performance-based pay raises, and capped some of these positions at a rate well below what many of these workers had previously made. Unsurprisingly, this outraged city employees. The Lindsay administration began working to implement the commission's plan, and were immediately met with massive opposition. Tammany politicians were still in city government, worked to block implementation at every turn. Many of the supervisors who would be needed to administer the tests Moses came up with were supervisors that had been appointed by Tammany. They promptly left his evaluation forms to gather dust in their offices. Many of the judges who had determined if Moses' plan was legal had been appointed to the bench by Tammany leaders as well, and they voted accordingly. The only thing that saved Moses' plan from being killed in the courts was that the outcry against the plan was so large, it ended up losing John Lindsay his re-election in 1917. He was instead replaced by Tammany candidate Mike Highland. Mike Highland's first act as mayor was to disband the Civil Service Commission and fire every single Bureau of Municipal Research staffer working for the city, including Moses. Robert Moses was out once again. With Mike Highland and Tammany in power, Moses was persona non grata in New York City. There were few city jobs available to former bureau staffers. There were no city jobs available to Robert Moses. He found himself applying for low-level civil service jobs across the country, including one in Cleveland, Ohio, for which he was not hired. This low point in his career also corresponded with the First World War. A friend from Yale assisted him in getting a job at the offices of an East Coast shipbuilding company. Soon after, though, he was run out by management for his outspoken nature. In 1918, Robert Moses received a call from Belle Moskowitz. She was the wife of Henry Moskowitz, his boss when he worked for the Civil Service Commission. She was also a trusted advisor of moderate Tammany Governor Alfred E. Smith. Moses' years at Yale and on the commission had taught him to be idealistic. Belle Moskowitz was about to teach him how to turn these ideas into reality. Moskowitz was a believer in pragmatic politics. Her work with Moses entailed a plan to restructure the state government of New York, but it wasn't going to be written like Moses' commission reports. On the commission, the grouping of jobs into categories was done purely with efficiency on the mind. Now Moskowitz explained that efficiency was the start, but someone was going to run each of those new departments. And wouldn't it be nice if they were grouped in a way that encouraged that person to support the new plan? Wording within the document was also softened. A phrase Moses loved in his commission report was the elimination of unnecessary personnel. This was no more. Personnel, Moskowitz explained, are voters, and you don't want to antagonize them. Moses and Moskowitz's maneuvering brought their new plan to the edge of reality. It passed the first round of legislative approvals. 2 were necessary since the plan required a constitutional amendment. The next year, an election put it on hold. Al Smith was voted out. After this defeat, Moses had a soft landing, continuing to work in the political circles of Smith and Moskowitz. In 1922, Al Smith was re-elected to the governorship. Moskowitz and Moses had their plan passed into law, and suddenly, Robert Moses had something he had never had before: power. With Al Smith fully on his side, Robert Moses had the opportunity to begin constructing his dreams. During his idealistic youth, he had dreamed up 100 different ways to improve the city. The unifying factor around all of these were parks. The summer after Smith was re-elected, Moses traveled to Long Island to visit his family's summer home in Babylon. And it was on these trips that he found the places where those parks would be. In 1920s New York, there was an endless demand for open space. As the city grew, the foresight behind the creation of Central Park only became clearer and clearer. However, this one great park wasn't going to be enough. In the boroughs, land was being developed at a lightning-fast rate, leaving the people of the city no place to relax and unwind. Moses saw a solution in the forests and the beaches of Long Island. During those summer trips, Moses hiked the untamed forest and discovered the sites of his first great parks, a set of lakes and fields isolated by woodland but only a few miles from Brooklyn, a vast sandbar known only to a group of reclusive fishermen, an abandoned estate used by Gilded Age millionaires as a hunting preserve. Each of these would soon become a park: Sunken Meadow, Jones Beach, and Belmont Lake respectively. But first, Robert Moses would have to shape them. Sunken Meadow was the first and the easiest. The lake that Moses had discovered actually already belonged to him, in a sense. The land was owned and apparently forgotten by the New York City watershed. All Moses had to do to acquire it was to get the city to transfer the land to his newly created Long Island State Park Commission. The city was happy to oblige, and despite opposition from local residents, Sunken Meadow became Robert Moses' first park. Now, opposition to parks, you might ask yourself, is an odd position to take, especially when you consider how much the city needed them. But Long Island isn't New York City. The people of New York immediately loved Robert Moses' parks, but the people of Long Island saw Moses and the New Yorkers he brought onto their land as interlopers. For the rest of the Long Island parks, they were going to fight him every step of the way. The reclusive fishermen who seemed to hold ownership over the land that would become Jones Beach were called the North Shoremen. They clustered together in a little township and hamlet that lined the coast, and they did not want to see a single New Yorker on the beaches that they owned. Or so they thought they owned. In fact, the townships and hamlets did not have ownership rights over the waterways, which the sandbar where Jones Beach was going to be built was a part. This land was owned by Nassau County. While not enthusiastic, Nassau was far more amenable to Moses' parks than the North Shoremen. After some time and a lot of political influence, the land for Jones Beach was his. Further east, in Suffolk County, home to the Gilded Age millionaires, Moses would find his greatest fight. The Taylor estate, later to become Belmont Lake, was owned by a group of America's wealthiest businessmen, and Robert Moses wanted it for himself. When Moses had drafted the legislation creating the Long Island State Park Commission, he had referenced an obscure piece of legislation from the late 1800s that gave him the power to seize property, as long as the commission had the money on hand to pay for it. This interpretation of the law gave him more power than any other government agency in the nation with regards to eminent domain. And still, it wasn't enough. Robert Moses broke his own law. The Taylor estate was worth $250,000. The Long Island State Park Commission's appropriation from the state legislature for that first year was $225,000. $25,000 less than the value of the estate. On top of that, Moses had spent about $60,000 on staff and elegant office space for the commission, never forgetting his lavish ways, meaning that the commission had at most $165,000 on hand, almost $100,000 less than the amount needed to comply with Moses' own law with regard to the Taylor estate seizure. In the court battle that ensued, Moses quickly won the press to his side. Whether or not what he was doing was blatantly illegal, he was still taking land from millionaire industrialists who had never cared too much for laws themselves, and giving it back to the people in the form of parks. For 2 years, courts and appeals courts heard the case. After exhausting the court system, pulling some strings to get a favorable judge on the case, and nearly bankrupting one of America's richest men with legal fees, Robert Moses had his park. And he wouldn't have to wait long to finish it. During the 2 years where the land technically wasn't his, despite multiple court orders telling him not to touch the property, Parks Commission staff had converted the hunting preserve into trails and playing fields, and the manor house into the Commission's new suite of offices. Moses moved on to the next phase of his parks, construction of their facilities. Budgetary issues would again plague him. He had magnificent plans, far beyond what the state legislature would appropriate through the Commission. Once again, Moses devised a solution, best explained through this anecdote about Jones Beach. The bathhouses, shower, and changing rooms for visitors that Moses envisioned at Jones Beach were nothing like anything anyone had ever seen before. These were to be mansions on the sand, with restaurants and lockers for 1 million visitors each. To the legislature, bathhouses were nothing more than a plywood building with 4 walls and a roof. They gave Moses $150,000 to construct 2 of these. Moses spent that $150,000 to build the foundation of 1 bathhouse. His appropriation was entirely spent, and the legislature was furious, but Moses backed them into a corner. They could either give him the rest of the money to complete the construction, or they could cut him off. But then they would have to go and tell the taxpayers how they gave him $150,000 to pour a bunch of concrete that was now being buried under the sand of a Long Island sandbar. The legislature gave in. In the end, Robert Moses built his 2 bathhouses, each one costing over $1 million to construct. Another lasting Moses program that began with the Long Island parks were the parkways for which he would become known. These were to be roads unlike any seen before. Beautiful drives that snaked between tree-lined forests and the Gold Coast. As he began to plan their routes, he ran afoul of the Long Island millionaires and local farmers once again. When the parkways ran across an estate, Moses would threaten the owner, saying he condemned their land and run the road right through their front lawns. Unless, of course, they'd like to donate some land on the edge of their property for the commission to use instead. When the parkways ran across farmland, Moses did not negotiate. Many a Long Island farmer was ruined when their fields were sliced in 2 by his massive highway. The parklands were also the site of one of Moses' most blatantly racist actions. In the 1920s, cars were largely a middle and upper class luxury. The working class and the poor of the city, especially in black neighborhoods, had to take the bus. Buses in the early 1920s were about 9 feet tall. Bridges on Robert Moses' Parkway had an 8-foot clearance. If you wanted to get to Jones Beach, you were going to need a car. An interesting note considering that Robert Moses never learned how to drive. The lessons of youth had prepared Moses for the Parks fight, and the lessons of the Parks fight helped prepare Robert Moses for what would come next. As the Great Depression began, the WPA presented opportunities for public projects on a previously unforeseen scale. Moses quickly learned how to capitalize on this system. The cities that had plans ready to build got the bulk of the WPA funding. Moses, with his team of architects, engineers, and draftsmen, made sure that New York always had plans. During this time, he focused his efforts on the overhaul of parks within New York City, where he was appointed the Parks Commissioner. During this era, he built or renovated hundreds of parks, including asphalt lots and the lawns and playgrounds. Of these hundreds of parks, less than 4 were built in majority black neighborhoods. He also overhauled Central Park, establishing long-desired playing fields and improving the deteriorating Central Park Zoo. This was also where Moses' greatest source of power would soon become clear, as his work with the WPA moved toward the construction of bridges. The construction of the Triborough Bridge became Moses' greatest tool in amassing the power he had desired. During the late 1930s, projects such as bridges were built by public authorities. A public authority is a special kind of government agency, autonomous from the leadership of the region where it exists. It is structured like a business and its finances are not public record. Funding is achieved through the selling of bonds, not through taxpayer dollars. Most essentially, they only exist long enough to serve their purpose, pay back their bonds, and then go out of existence. But not Robert Moses' Triborough. The Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority, on its surface, had all the hallmarks of a traditional authority. It was funded by bonds, structured like a corporation, and existed to build the Triborough Bridge. A closer look, the kind that Moses made sure no one would be allowed to take, revealed that it was unlike any other. The jurisdiction of the Triborough Bridge wasn't just its bridge, but all the roads connecting to it, and all the roads connecting to those roads. This theoretically gave Triborough jurisdiction over the entire city of New York. Most importantly, Triborough was never going to go out of existence. This one didn't require any legislative tricks. The new authority would simply never pay back all of its bonds. Every time it was about to complete payments, a new set of bonds would be issued, keeping it in operation. The only catch here was that Triborough would have to build continuously, and that wasn't going to be a problem for Robert Moses. From 1934 until the 1960s, Robert Moses had de facto control over all public instruction within the city of New York. During this time, he held 12 government positions, all without ever winning a single election. He was in charge of bridge construction, overseeing the creation of 5 bridges in and out of New York City. He was the commissioner of the Long Island, New York State, and New York City Park Commissions. He oversaw the construction of highways, pulling almost infinite funding from the post-war interstate plan. From the 1940s onward, he built 3 expressways across New York City. These had devastating effects on traffic in New York forever after. The placement of these roads, almost always through primarily black or Jewish communities, was also no accident. These once vibrant communities, in many cases, were forever shadowed by the shadow of Moses' highways. He also built institutions. Moses was directly responsible for the construction of Lincoln Center and Shea Stadium. He also played a role in convincing the United Nations to construct their General Assembly in New York. Moses also achieved what he had been working for most of his career: power. Robert Moses had never won an election, but elected officials had to do what he said. In 1954, Reform Mayor Robert Wagner had run on a platform that included removing Moses from his seat on the Planning Commission. This was a clear conflict of interest, considering that Moses would be voting to approve projects that Moses proposed. During the appointment ceremony, Wagner followed through on his promise, appointing Moses to be the Director of Public Housing and the Commissioner of Parks, but not to the Planning Commission. After the ceremony ended, a furious Moses burst into the mayor's office, demanding the 3rd appointment, or he would resign the other 2. The quintessential Robert Moses threat. Wagner knew that the newspapers would tear into him if it looked like Robert Moses was being pushed out by his administration, especially from his city parks department job. So he deferred, saying that there had been a mistake and that Moses would receive his appointment on Monday. Moses said he was going to receive the appointment today, picking up a blank appointment form off the mayor's desk and completing it himself. There was silence, as Robert Moses signed the form and Moses was reappointed to the City Planning Commission. In 1960, the 30 years of good press that followed Robert Moses began to fade. His fall began with a simple battle over the construction of a parking lot. The area chosen for the lot was a historic playground in Central Park, and the mothers who lived nearby did not want to see it go. As demolition was scheduled to begin, they occupied the playground, disrupting work. Moses responded how he had during the Taylor Estate fight, sending in police to guard the grounds. The next day, when the mothers began to protest, they found themselves faced down by armed NYPD officers. One of them called a friend who was a reporter at a local paper, and suddenly, Moses had a PR nightmare on his hands. In the end, he got his parking lot. He paid for it with his good name. No longer did the newspapers call him Robert Moses, defender of parks. He was now Robert Moses, the man who drove the bulldozer, a symbol of destruction in New York in the 1960s. Elsewhere in the city, Moses' bulldozers were getting him into even more trouble. His slum clearance programs to build new public housing were turning into the site of endless construction that had evicted thousands from their homes. As journalists investigated the claims of former residents that said they'd been kicked out and given no place to go, they found layers of corruption surrounding the project. Contractors who had been awarded the work on the project were not chosen because they had been the most qualified. They were instead selected for their connections to Robert Moses and his inner circle. Rumors even began that kickbacks may have been paid to the housing commissioner. This revelation of greed was especially shocking, considering that Moses had spent most of his career claiming that almost all of his public positions were unpaid. These two scandals had taken the tools Moses had used to construct his empire. The Central Park fight ended his good relationship with the press, and the slum clearance scandal tarnished his reputation as an honest man in politics. Even still, Moses had thought of a last-ditch effort to guarantee his legacy, the 1964 World's Fair. The World's Fair for Robert Moses was a disaster. From the start, his hard-headedness and inability to compromise soured his relationship with everyone involved. As the president of the fair, it was his job to meet with the Bureau of International Expositions, the organization that oversaw World's Fairs. During this meeting, Moses insulted their leadership to their face and lost New York's exhibition official sanction. This was then met with boycotts by many of the nations who had originally said they would participate in the fair. Its greatest flaw, one found in almost every Moses project, was its cost. The fair opened in 1964 at a far higher cost than had been projected. In order to repay its investors, it would need to see record high attendance. That never happened. On top of this, a fair official made an accounting error that led to the organization being even deeper in debt than was initially thought when it closed in 1966. In a last controversial act, Moses, instead of paying back what he could to his investors, took that money and sunk it into the construction of Flushing Meadows Park on the former fair site. This only reinforced the idea that Moses was either directly engaged in, or at the very least party to, corruption. At the fair's conclusion, Moses had only his Triborough commissionership left. Accepting the fair presidency forced him to resign from all other state and local positions. In 1968, Mayor John Lindsay and Governor Nelson Rockefeller, two longtime political adversaries of Moses, merged the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority with the citywide Metropolitan Transportation Authority. After over 30 years of being in, Robert Moses was out for the final time. In 1974, The Power Broker, a meticulously researched account of Moses' life and career, was published by Robert A. Caro. Caro was one of the journalists who had been reporting on Moses' housing project scandal in the early 1960s. The book also served as the basis for this video, and painted Moses in a less than positive light. In a sad irony, Moses, a man obsessed with legacy, lived long enough to see his life chronicled in 1,300 pages that painted him as power-hungry, racist, and out of touch. A man whose life's work had destroyed the city that he once thought he could save. Robert Moses died in 1981. He was 92 years old. The story of Robert Moses' work leaves many with conflicting feelings. Setting aside his racism and classism that seems to have been present his entire life, much of Moses' early work doesn't feel laced with bad intentions. The Long Island parks, and even some of his Depression-era construction, undoubtedly changed New York for the better. Without Jones Beach, sunken meadow, and the thousands of acres of parkland he created thereafter, the people of New York would have been trapped in the concrete jungle with no hope of relief. It's no exaggeration either to say that only Robert Moses could have built those parks. He understood the political system and atmosphere of the time like no other. His greatest weakness was his greatness. The Robert Moses who built the Long Island parks was a great man. The only problem was he knew it. As he moved through his career, Robert Moses became blinded by his own success. This inability to consider ideas that others proposed poisoned his later work. Expressways were built with no provisions for public transportation, something that dozens of city officials and his own advisors said they should have. This left many parts of New York clogged by cars with no alternative, even today, 80 years later. His racism and classism compounded these flaws. He made New York City a place that was inconvenient to live if you were rich, but in a way that made it exponentially worse if you were poor or black. As far as I'm concerned, Moses' worst offense isn't what he did to New York City. It's that he had the influence necessary to export those ideas across the rest of the United States. During his heyday, Moses was hired by many U.S. cities to design highway systems that left their own downtowns clogged with cars just as badly as New York's. His career played a central role in the dominance of individually owned cars as the primary and sometimes only means of transportation across many places in the United States, something that has clogged our cities, wasted hours of our lives, and permanently tarnished our environment. If I had to sum up the career of Robert Moses in one word, it would be irony. For everything he created, he left destruction in his wake.